Before we begin this emotional Viking tale, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more historical stories, and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. The winter had been merciless to the small farming settlement nestled between the rolling hills and the distant forest. What began as a season of hope had transformed into months of despair, as crop failures and harsh weather decimated the community's food stores. The wooden houses, once warm with the sounds of children's laughter and evening conversations, now stood silent except for the occasional cough or whispered prayer. Ingrid pressed a thin hand against the cold stone wall of her dwelling, feeling the rough texture beneath her palm as she gazed through the small window at the barren landscape beyond. Snow covered everything in a deceptive blanket of purity, hiding the reality of the dying earth beneath. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air of her home, where even the hearth had grown cold for lack of fuel. The young woman turned her attention to the corner where her son lay sleeping on a pile of worn furs. Little Olaf, barely 3 years old, had grown frighteningly thin over the past weeks. His once round cheeks had become hollow, and his breathing seemed more labored with each passing day. The sight of him made her chest tighten with a pain that went beyond physical hunger. "Mother!" came a weak voice from the shadows. Her elderly father sat hunched on a wooden stool, his weathered hands shaking as he attempted to mend a torn piece of cloth. The task seemed to drain what little energy he had left. "Yes, father." Ingrid moved closer, noticing how his eyes had grown dim and unfocused over the recent days. "The grain. Is it truly gone?" His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen many hardships but had never faced starvation so directly. Ingrid nodded slowly, unable to find words that might offer comfort. They had consumed the last handful of barley 3 days ago, mixed with melted snow to create a thin gruel that barely qualified as sustenance. Even the dried herbs hanging from the rafters had been boiled into bitter teas in desperate attempts to fill their empty stomachs. The settlement's other families faced similar circumstances. Old Eric, the village elder, had already lost his youngest grandson to the cold and hunger. The blacksmith's wife had grown so weak she could barely tend to their remaining animals. Even the strongest men now walked with the uncertain gait of those whose bodies were consuming themselves to survive. As if summoned by her thoughts, a soft knocking came at the wooden door. Ingrid opened it to find her neighbor, Astrid's mother, though the woman looked so changed that for a moment Ingrid didn't recognize her. The once sturdy farmer's wife now appeared frail and hollow-eyed. "Ingrid, child," the woman whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "There are strangers approaching from the north road. Armed men. But they carry trade goods." The news sent a mixture of hope and fear through Ingrid's weary mind. Strangers could mean opportunity, but they could also bring danger to a settlement already weakened by months of hardship. She gathered her thin woolen cloak around her shoulders and followed her neighbor outside. The settlement's remaining inhabitants had gathered near the central area, their gaunt faces turned toward the approaching figures. Even from a distance, it was clear these were not ordinary traders. The men moved with the confident bearing of seasoned travelers, their clothing suggesting they came from lands beyond the familiar territories. Leading the group was a tall figure whose presence seemed to command attention without effort. His hair, the color of wheat touched by summer sun, was braided in the style common to northern peoples. Unlike the desperate villagers, his face showed the healthy complexion of one who had not known hunger, and his clothing, while practical for travel, was well-made and warm. The stranger's eyes swept across the gathered villagers with a calculating gaze that missed nothing. He seemed to take note of their condition, the hollow cheeks, the threadbare clothing, the way they held themselves with the careful movements of those conserving energy. When his gaze briefly met Ingrid's, she felt an involuntary shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "Good people," the stranger spoke, his voice carrying easily across the small gathering. His accent marked him as one of the northern seafaring folk, though his words were clear and understandable. "I am called Gunnar. My companions and I travel the trading routes, bringing goods to settlements such as yours." Old Eric stepped forward, his role as elder compelling him to respond despite his obvious frailty. "Welcome, travelers. Though I fear we have little to offer in trade. The winter has been difficult." The man called Gunnar nodded slowly, as if this information came as no surprise. "We have observed the signs," he replied. "Failed harvests, harsh weather. These challenges are not uncommon in these lands." He gestured to his companions, who began unpacking bundles from their sledges. The sight of actual food, loaves of dark bread, dried meat, even some preserved fruits, caused visible reactions among the villagers. Children who had learned to suppress their hunger began to whimper, while adults struggled to maintain their composure in the face of such temptation. "We understand the value of sustenance in times such as these," Gunnar continued, his tone remaining businesslike despite the desperation visible in his audience. "And we are prepared to trade fairly for what we need. But what could we possibly offer?" Eric's voice cracked with the strain of admitting their poverty. "Our stores are empty, our livestock mostly gone." The trader's eyes once again swept across the group, lingering momentarily on various individuals. "There are many forms of value," he said simply. "Labor, service, knowledge of local conditions. Arrangements can be made." Ingrid felt her heart begin to race as she processed the implications of his words. Around her, other villagers shifted uncomfortably, some beginning to understand what might be expected in exchange for the precious food the strangers carried. As the crowd began to disperse, with some villagers approaching the traders to inquire about possible exchanges, Ingrid remained frozen in place. Her mind raced through their options, each one seeming more impossible than the last. They possessed nothing of material value that these well-supplied travelers might want. Returning to her dwelling, she found little Olaf awake and crying weakly, a sound that had become heartbreakingly common as hunger sapped even his ability to protest vigorously. She lifted him into her arms, feeling how light he had become, how his small body seemed to have grown fragile as a bird's. "I'm hungry, mother," he whispered against her shoulder, the words barely audible. "I know, my precious one," she murmured back, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Mother knows." Her father looked up from his corner, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of their situation. "The traders," he said quietly. "What did they want?" "I'm not certain," Ingrid replied, though her mind had already begun working through the terrible mathematics of their desperation. How much was a life worth? How much was freedom worth? How did one weigh the value of tomorrow against the cost of today? As evening approached, word spread through the settlement about the various arrangements some villagers had made with the traders. Young Henrik, the carpenter's son, had agreed to travel north with them for a season's work in exchange for enough food to sustain his aging parents through the remainder of the winter. The widow Solveig had traded her late husband's finest tools for a small sack of grain. But for those with nothing to offer but themselves or their loved ones, the choices became increasingly stark. Ingrid spent the night holding her son, listening to his labored breathing and feeling the sharp outline of his ribs through his thin clothing. Her father slept fitfully, occasionally muttering words from his youth when such hardships had seemed unimaginable. By morning, Ingrid had made her decision. Dawn broke grey and cheerless over the settlement, matching the heaviness in Ingrid's heart as she prepared to approach the traders' camp. They had established themselves just outside the village proper, their well-organized site a stark contrast to the desperate improvisation that characterized the villagers' daily existence. She had spent the hours before sunrise memorizing every detail of her son's sleeping face, the way his pale eyelashes rested against his thin cheeks, the soft sound of his breathing, the small hand that had curled trustingly around her finger even in sleep. These moments felt precious beyond measure, knowing they might be among the last peaceful ones they would share. Her father had awakened early as well, though neither had spoken about what the day might bring. Some conversations were too painful to voice, even between family members who loved each other deeply. Instead, they had shared the ritual of their morning routine, checking their empty food stores, tidying their sparse belongings, and maintaining the small dignities that helped distinguish humans from mere animals struggling to survive. "Mother!" Olaf's voice was barely a whisper as he stirred in her arms. "Are we going to eat today?" The question pierced through her remaining resolve like a blade. "Yes, my darling," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Today you will eat." She dressed him carefully in his warmest clothing, which now hung loosely on his diminished frame. Each piece of worn fabric felt significant as she smoothed it into place. His little woolen tunic that she had sewn with such hope during her pregnancy, the tiny boots that had once been snug but now seemed too large for his feet. The walk to the trader's camp felt both endless and far too short. With each step, Ingrid rehearsed the words she would speak, trying to find a way to articulate her request that might preserve some fragment of dignity for both herself and her child. But how did one bargain away everything that mattered while maintaining any sense of self-worth? Gunnar stood near a small fire, directing his companions as they organized their goods for another day of trading. His movements were efficient and purposeful, those of a man accustomed to command and comfortable with authority. When he noticed her approach, he straightened and turned his full attention toward her. "Good morning," he said simply, his tone neutral but not unkind. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a pale blue-gray, like winter ice, and seemed to take in far more than they revealed. "Good morning," Ingrid replied, her voice catching slightly. Little Olaf pressed closer to her side, sensing the tension in the air even if he couldn't understand its source. For a moment, neither adult spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding of why a desperate mother might seek out strangers who possessed what her child needed to survive. Around them, the sounds of the camp continued, men checking equipment, discussing routes, preparing for departure, but these seemed distant and muffled. "You have something to discuss," Gunnar observed finally. It was not a question. Ingrid nodded, finding it difficult to meet his steady gaze. "My son," she began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was about to propose. She looked down at Olaf, who was watching the traders with the wide-eyed fascination of a child who had been isolated from strangers for most of his young life. "He's hungry," she continued, the words coming out in a rush. "We have nothing left. No food, no goods to trade, no. Nothing." Her voice broke on the last word, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. "But he's strong and smart, and if someone could feed him—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The words hung in the cold air between them, their implication clear even without being fully voiced. Gunnar's expression remained unreadable as he considered her offer, his gaze shifting between mother and child. "You would give him to strangers?" he asked quietly, and there was something in his tone that might have been surprise, or perhaps a test. "I would give him a chance to live," Ingrid replied, her voice steadier now that the worst had been spoken. "What kind of mother would I be if I let him starve when there might be another way?" Little Olaf looked up at her with confusion beginning to cloud his innocent features. "Mother, what are you talking about?" She knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in hers. They felt so cold, so fragile. "Olaf, my brave boy, do you remember the stories I tell you about adventures? About brave children who go on journeys to faraway places?" He nodded solemnly, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "These kind men have food, and they travel to many wonderful places. If you went with them, you could eat every day, and see things that most children never get to see. But what about you, mother?" His voice was small and frightened. "Would you come too?" Ingrid felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. I would want to, my darling, but—" "She comes too." Gunnar's voice cut through her explanation, surprising both mother and child. Ingrid looked up at him in shock. What? You both come," he repeated, his tone matter-of-fact. "A child needs his mother, especially during travel. And you?" His eyes assessed her with the same calculating look he had given the village the day before. "You have value as well." The relief that flooded through Ingrid was so intense it made her dizzy. She had been prepared to sacrifice everything for her son's survival, but this unexpected possibility seemed to offer salvation for them both. "You mean, together? We could stay together." Gunnar nodded once, curtly. "There are always needs for willing workers in the northern settlements. People who understand the value of opportunity when it is offered." He gestured toward his companions, who were loading the last of their trade goods onto the sledges. "We leave within the hour. Gather what you can carry. Say your farewells quickly." Ingrid rose on unsteady legs, hardly daring to believe that this solution had presented itself. "Thank you," she whispered, tears beginning to flow freely down her cheeks. "Thank you for your kindness." The trader's expression didn't change, but he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgment before turning away to supervise the final preparations for departure. The next hour passed in a blur of hasty preparations and painful goodbyes. Her father, despite his own weakness, insisted on helping her gather their few possessions. Some clothing, a small knife that had been her grandfather's, and a wooden toy horse that Olaf treasured above all else. "Take care of each other," the old man whispered as he embraced his daughter and grandson one final time. "Remember who you are, no matter where this journey leads." Other villagers gathered to see them off, some with envy in their eyes for this apparent stroke of fortune, others with sympathy for the necessity that had driven a mother to such desperate measures. Old Eric offered a blessing for their journey, his weathered hands trembling as he placed them briefly on Olaf's head. As they joined the traders' group, Ingrid felt a mixture of hope and apprehension that made her stomach flutter with nervous energy. The men were efficient but not unkind, helping to arrange space for the new travelers and ensuring they had adequate protection from the cold. Little Olaf seemed excited by the novelty of the situation, chattering about the sledges and asking questions about their destination. His energy, bolstered by the promise of regular meals ahead, was the first sign of his old self that Ingrid had seen in weeks. True to his word, Gunnar provided them with food before they departed. Thick slices of dark bread and strips of dried meat that tasted better than any feast Ingrid could remember. She watched her son eat with an appetite she had feared was lost forever, and felt the first stirrings of genuine hope since the beginning of their ordeal. The journey north began under a sky heavy with the promise of more snow, but the traders moved with the confidence of men familiar with winter travel. Their sledges cut efficiently through the accumulated drifts, and their pace, while steady, was not so demanding as to exhaust their new companions. For the first 2 days, the arrangement seemed almost too good to be true. They were fed regularly, simple meals, but more food than Ingrid and Olaf had seen in months. They were kept warm and dry, included in the evening camps, and treated with what seemed like reasonable consideration. Gunnar remained somewhat distant but not hostile, occasionally checking to ensure they were managing the journey adequately. His men were similarly professional, focused on their travel but not actively unfriendly. Ingrid began to allow herself to believe that they had indeed been rescued from their desperate circumstances. On the third evening, as they made camp beside a frozen stream, Olaf fell asleep quickly in the warm furs that had been provided for their use. His breathing was easier now, his color improved, and he had even laughed that afternoon at something one of the men had said. Watching him sleep peacefully, Ingrid felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "You are satisfied with our arrangement?" Gunnar's voice came from behind her as she sat watching her son. "More than satisfied," she replied, turning to face him. "You have given us life itself. I don't know how to repay such kindness." Something flickered across his features, an expression too quick to interpret. "Repayment will be addressed when we reach our destination," he said quietly. "For now, rest. Tomorrow we reach the settlement." That night, Ingrid slept more peacefully than she had in months, her son warm and fed beside her, the promise of a new beginning filling her dreams with possibilities she had not dared to imagine during the darkest days of winter. She did not notice the quiet conversation that took place between Gunnar and his men on the far side of the dying fire, nor the way they checked and rechecked certain items in their packs as they prepared for the final day of travel. The truth would wait for morning. As dawn broke on the fourth day, Ingrid awoke to find the camp bustling with activity that seemed different from previous mornings. The traders moved with a new sense of purpose, their conversations conducted in hushed tones that didn't carry to where she and Olaf were gathering their belongings. When the settlement came into view, nestled in a valley between snow-covered hills, Ingrid felt her heart lift with anticipation. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily activities, a thriving community that promised the new beginning she had dreamed of. But as their sledge drew closer, details began to emerge that made her stomach tighten with unease. The people she saw were not the free villagers she had imagined, but individuals whose movements and posture spoke of lives constrained by circumstances beyond their choosing. The settlement, while prosperous, had an organization that felt more like control than community. Gunnar's demeanor had changed as well. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by the bearing of a man conducting business rather than offering charity. When he helped her down from the sledge, his grip was firm but impersonal, and his eyes held no warmth. "Welcome to your new home," he said, and the words carried a finality that made Ingrid's blood run cold. It was then that she understood the true nature of their rescue. The food, the kindness, the promise of staying together, all had been tools to secure their cooperation during the journey. Now, in this place far from everything familiar, surrounded by strangers whose loyalties clearly lay with their captors rather than their fellow captives, the reality of their situation became inescapably clear. Little Olaf, still innocent of the transformation in their circumstances, tugged at her hand. "Mother, when do we eat again? I'm getting hungry." Looking down at his trusting face, Ingrid felt the last of her illusions crumble. She had saved his life, perhaps, but at a cost that was only now becoming clear. In her desperate love for her child, she had delivered them both into a bondage that might prove more terrible than the starvation they had left behind. The Viking had indeed said nothing, but his silence had spoken volumes. And now, as she watched him accept payment from the settlement's leader, while other newcomers were led away to quarters that looked more like prison cells than homes, Ingrid understood that some rescues come at prices too terrible to calculate until it is far too late to refuse them. In saving her son's body, she may have condemned both their souls. And in the growing shadows of their new reality, the hunger they had escaped seemed almost merciful compared to the captivity that now awaited them. The story of their survival had become the story of their enslavement, and the winter that had nearly killed them was nothing compared to the seasons of servitude that stretched ahead like an endless, frozen wasteland from which there might never be escape.